Hello! I hope that you enjoyed your holiday season and that your year is off to a good start. And of course that you're ready for a new video. And this video is going to be a little bit unusual for me because here I'm actually setting up a 5-year journal, which is a first for me. So I'm kind of weirdly excited about that, and I hope you are too. Now, before I get into how this journal is actually going to work, let me tell you a little bit about the notebook, or two notebooks, but I'll get into that later as well, that I will be using for this journal. And this is basically just a plain lined notebook. It's definitely on the cheaper side, but I kind of decided that I would be doing a journal like this like yesterday, so I needed a notebook ASAP, and this was what I could find on short notice. As you can see though, I definitely wanted to spice it up a little bit, so I added a butterfly to the front. And I will of course be adding another one just like it to my second journal because I wanted them to look identical, at least on the outside. And I thought that even just this little touch made the journals look a lot more interesting and a little bit more high-end. This is definitely something that you can do to any plain journal or plain notebook that you have lying around that you want to decorate just a little bit. You can grab any sort of stickers, washi tape, or even print something out and add it to the cover. And of course you can go as creative as you want and add as many stickers as you want, or whatever else you're adding. But I actually really like the look of just one image in the center of the notebook. Now of course you can leave your notebook just like that, but I decided to take a little extra step and gild the edges of my notebook. So basically what that means is that I'm going to paint the edges of my notebooks in gold. Now, I know that usually this is done very differently in a professional setting. They, I don't know, do some complicated process and it definitely does look much better. But I didn't have any of that and I still wanted my notebook to have gold edges. So I just went with acrylic paint. I did really love how this came out, and it's actually really easy to do if you want to repeat the process. I do have a few tips for you, however. The first one is that if you want the paint to not seep in between the pages, then you should probably use some sort of weight on top of your notebook. I didn't, I just held it in my hand as tightly as I could, and I did have some paint seeping in between the pages, but I was kind of expecting that, and I didn't have anything to really press my notebook down with, so I decided to just let that be one of the quirks of my particular notebook. And again, if you don't mind a little bit of paint seeping between your pages, then you can absolutely do that just by holding the notebook tightly in your hand as you're painting it. Now, something else that you might want to do is cover the cover of your notebook in painter's tape or washi tape, so that you don't actually get any of the metallic paint on the sides of your cover. Again, I didn't do that, mostly because I just didn't feel like it. I don't know, I can get lazy about things like that, and I thought that the paint kind of blended in fairly well into the color of my cover. But if the cover of your notebook is a very different color from whatever paint you're using, so say like a blue notebook and gold paint, then you might want to add that extra step, or don't if you like the sort of rustic look of the paint being on the edges of your notebook, which, I don't know, I'm kind of digging it a little bit. Now, another thing that I want to mention is that you can of course use any color of paint that you want to paint the edges of your notebook. It doesn't have to be gold. You can go with silver, copper, or even something that is a lot less traditional. Like, for example, paint your edges a rainbow of different colors. Go wild! The only thing is that you do want to stick to paint that is more opaque, because the more paint you use, the more likely it is that there will be paint seeping between your pages, and the more your pages will actually stick together. Now, I used acrylic paint, which is just naturally sticky. I know that there are some very opaque watercolors out there, but they're a lot more runny, so I feel like they might seep between your pages a lot more, but I also think that they probably won't make your pages stick together as much. Again, I didn't try watercolors, so I don't know how that will work. I might try that out on a future notebook though, and I will let you know if I do. And once that's all done, you let that dry for a little bit. If you're using acrylic paint, that should be fairly quickly, because it does dry very quickly. And then you can enjoy your beautiful, shiny notebook. And you will now have to separate the pages. Again, you don't have to separate all of them at the same time, you can just sort of separate them as you go along. And I actually have a tip for separating the pages that I found out the hard way after I ripped a few pages trying to separate them. Some of them came apart really easily, and some of them didn't. Some of them really stuck together, and I found it really hard to separate them. So first of all, you sort of grab the bigger chunks and you split them into smaller sections until you run into a problem, and usually that problem consists of 2 pages that are stuck together really well. And to separate those, I found it really helpful to sort of bend and wiggle the page until I found a hole that I could stick my finger into, and then I would just move my finger all around the edges of the page until I had the pages completely separated, and that actually prevented them from ripping. I know this sounds pretty weird. I really hope that I'm explaining it well and that this is actually helpful. I definitely wanted to warn you that it did take me maybe 5 minutes or so to separate the pages that I'm going to be using for this setup, so if you know that pages sticking together is going to really annoy you, then you probably shouldn't go with this DIY. So now that we have our notebooks a little bit more decorated, it's time to actually start the setup. And since this is going to be a 5-year journal, it might be nice to go with something a little bit more minimal, just to make sure that you don't get sick of it looking at it every day. But of course, that's just my preference, and you know, you do you, always. So to make that happen, I started off with some craft paper as a backing for some of my title. Now, I'm using craft paper because that's what I had, but you can use any sort of brown paper that you get, maybe with a food delivery or with a package. I'm actually starting off my title by writing the words 1 line a day using this gold pen and a stencil. If you've seen any of my other videos, you know that I am definitely not the best at calligraphy, so I like to use stencils and lettering stickers for more important title pages, and then I'll just use my best writing for all the other spreads. Here I'm writing the words 1 line a day, and that is basically what this journal is going to be. And I don't mean to keep you in suspense or anything, it's just I think that it will be much better if I explain it when you actually see me setting up one of the daily spreads for this journal. So for now, suffice it to say that this journal is supposed to last 5 years, except usually this is a journal that has 365 pages, and usually they're pre-made and you can purchase them. But the reason I'm actually setting up my own is because I've noticed that all the pre-purchased journals, well, first of all, they would take a really long time to get to me and I wanted to get started ASAP, and secondly, they all tend to be really small, and my writing tends to be on the larger side, so I felt like I wouldn't be able to squeeze in anything into those journals, and I definitely wanted to have more space. So that's pretty much why I went with the larger journals. And why I have 2 of them? Well, that's because each journal only has 190 pages. I think it's actually really difficult to find a notebook that has over 365 pages. Rather than splitting up each page into 2 sections and giving myself less space to write, I decided to use 2 notebooks. And my first one is going to be January to September, which I'm also writing out using that same stencil, but this time I'm using black pen just to add a little bit more variety. That will leave my second notebook to be July to December. I did mention that I wanted this spread to be a little bit more minimal, so the only other decoration I added was this butterfly that comes from the same set that I used for the cover. It also has a black and gold color scheme which tied in nicely to the rest of the colors I used in the spread. The next spread I set up is actually a really simple index. And I'm actually only going to add the page numbers for the first spread of the month, to make it easier for myself to find a particular month if I want to. Again, I'm keeping things consistent with the same black and gold color scheme. And on the right side of this, I set up my January title page. I used my stencil once again for the name of the month, just to make it a little bit prettier, I guess, than if I had written it by hand. And I filled it in with my gold pen in a sort of sketchy way. Again, I kept this title page fairly minimal, and the first thing I added was a quote in silver pen. And the quote says, "Healing is a matter of time, but it's also sometimes a matter of opportunity." And I just wanted to add this quote because I wanted to remind myself that sometimes it's important to really put in the effort and push yourself to heal yourself. Because yes, time does help, but it only helps if you also try to help yourself. To finish off the spread, I added a polar bear photo, which you probably have guessed that I really like polar bears, so much so in fact that my significant other actually calls me a polar bear sometimes, even though I'm always cold. So we have this running joke that I'm a rare species of tropical polar bears. So now that you know my deep dark secret, do you have any fun nicknames that people use for you? Let me know in the comments below, I'm actually really curious. Anyways, the final touch for this spread was a little bit of winter-themed washi tape to go with the January feel, and a little bit of neutral grid washi tape, which I also added to my index afterwards when I realized that it looked a little bit empty. And I also added a little bit of black and gold starry washi tape to that as well, just because it matched the color scheme. Now we're going to start off by setting up the first daily spread, and this is the moment we've all been waiting for, and it is the moment when I finally explain what a one-line-a-day journal actually means. So here we go! Now, I realized that you might already know what that means, but I definitely didn't until very recently, and I don't think it's a very common journal to keep, so I'm actually going to talk a little bit about that now. Basically, a one-line-a-day journal has a page that corresponds to a particular day of the year. So, for example, January 10th. And then that page is split into 5 separate sections, with each section corresponding to a particular year. So if we're going with the January 10th example, we would have one section that is January 10th, 2021, another that is January 10th, 2022, and so on until you get to January 10th, 2025, because it's a 5-year journal. And the sections are normally fairly small, and you can write whatever you want in them. So like your thoughts, your feelings, what you did that day. It's sort of like a memory-keeping journal. And the interesting thing about that is that once you've completed at least a year, you get to look back very easily and see what you did or felt or thought a year or more before on that exact day. And you can sort of see how your life changed. And I think that that is actually very, very interesting. Now, to actually set up this one-line-a-day journal, I put the date at the top of each page. I used gold pen for this throughout the entire month, and I will probably use it throughout the entire journal, just because I wanted to keep things consistent and I wanted my dates to match all the other gold elements that I have going on in this journal already. And I also used the same gold pen for the years, which I have on the left and the right sides of my pages. Another thing that I'm doing for each spread is separating each year with a colored line. And you can see that I'm using blue for this here, and I will actually be using 4 different colors of blue pen for this throughout the month, and that's just because I wanted to give my spreads a little bit more variety since they were all kind of looking the same. I will also add one more element that I will show you at the end to spice my spreads up just a little bit more. But first, let me just tell you about why I decided to use 4 lines for each year. So I pretty much counted the number of lines on each page, and in the case of my notebook I had 22 lines. I knew that I wanted this to be a 5-year journal, so I had to divide that by 5, and of course there's no easy way to do that. So I had 2 lines left over. Now, I could have put both of them at the bottom or both of them at the top, and I could have just added some sort of decorative element there, but I decided to leave one at the bottom and add one at the top. Now, the number of lines that you have left over once you've divided by 5 will really depend on the size of your notebook. You might have more, you might have less. Again, you might also have much smaller sections or much larger sections, depending on how many lines you have in general. I think that if you actually have an even number of lines left over, it's nice to add an equal number at the top and at the bottom of your spread. But if you have an odd number of extra lines, then where you add them is entirely up to you. But if you wanted to make them a little bit less empty, you could always add a piece of washi tape to wherever you have the most empty space. In fact, I will actually be adding a strip of washi tape to the top of my spreads after I finish setting up the basics. So let me just quickly show you that now. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to add washi tape to the top of each spread. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to make the spreads a little bit more interesting because they were looking a little bit plain, and I wanted to sort of separate the date from each year. I was actually debating with myself as I was setting up the spreads whether or not I was going to do this because I had this idea a little bit earlier, but I knew that it would take me some extra time and I wasn't even sure that I would have enough washi tape. But to combat that, I actually decided to use 4 different rolls of sort of bluish themed washi, because I knew that if I only used 1 roll of washi tape, I would probably run out of it about halfway through the month, or maybe even earlier, and that would be a problem. Now, I realized that you might not actually have so many different washi tapes that would correspond to the same color scheme or theme. I'm a bit of a washi tape addict, so I happened to have 4 different blue rolls. But if you don't, you can use several different rolls as long as they all sort of match your theme, or even if they don't, you can have a lot more variety in your spreads. Or you can actually take a thicker roll of washi tape and cut that into halves or into thirds or even quarters. This will work especially well if your washi tape has a more repeating pattern, because it won't be very noticeable that you've actually cut it into smaller sections. Now, of course, you don't even have to use washi tape. You can just use a fun border, or you can use lines. For example, I think it would actually be really fun to take a few different colors of markers, anywhere from 2 to maybe 4, and to just sort of stack them on top of each other to make a really cool header. Or you can even add that to the bottom of your spread as well, or to both the bottom and the top of your spread. And after all of that, the last thing that I did was actually number my pages. And you may notice that I'm actually only numbering the even pages, and that's just because I think that that's more than enough for me to use as a reference. And honestly, this is just another one of those things that I tend to get lazy about, she said after spending 3 hours on this journal already. I don't know what to tell you. I am weird. And that was it for my 1 line a day 5-year DIY journal. That was a mouthful. Anyways, I really hope that you enjoyed this setup and that maybe you might be interested in starting a 1 line a day 5-year journal of your own. Now, if you don't want to go the DIY route, I will actually have a bunch linked in the description down below, but keep in mind that they do tend to be very small, and if you don't like that, well, the DIY route is probably the best option for you. This setup was definitely a little bit of a challenge for me, but I'm really glad that I went for it anyways, and I'm actually really excited to start my 1 line a day journal. Of course, I will also be showing you how I'm going to be setting up the rest of the months in both of these journals, so that is definitely coming your way in the future. And as I do that, I will also definitely let you know how my 1 line a day 5-year journal is working out for me so far. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in my next video. Be you, always. Bye!